Wait, where? What? I'm in a box!
Oh no. No, not the box.
This is the Escape the Zoo podcast. With your host, Daniel Clark.
What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the Escape the Zoo podcast, where we talk everything wildlife. Today's guest is Rebecca Stirnemann, a biologist, conservationist, and writer from New Zealand. Rebecca has spent nearly a decade working to protect the little dodo, the critically endangered national bird of Samoa. The little dodo is the last remaining species in its genus, so obviously super important to protect, and it's a really interesting conversation. I hope you enjoyed as much as I did, so without further ado, here it is, my chat with the one and only Rebecca Stirnemann. Well, Rebecca, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us. You are doing some wild, crazy, incredible conservation work on the little dodo bird. So let's just get right into it. What is a little dodo bird, and why have you chosen to take it under your wing, so to speak? I didn't mean that bad pun there, but let's keep rolling.
Well, I suppose it's real. Like the little dodo was what the people who first discovered it called it. But the local people in Samoa call it the manu mea, which I suppose is the red-beaked beast, is how someone translated it to me once. And then the other name for it is a tooth-billed pigeon. And again, it's named after, because it has this massive tooth bill, which comes forward, and it's like a big pigeon. So,
okay.
Yeah. But it's called the little dodo because, it looked like the dodo when people first discovered it, when they actually came through from America on a boat. So when they discovered it from, I suppose, that end of the world, they thought it was like the dodo, and then they called it the little dodo, thinking it was like a very, very close relative.
I feel like the dodo bird, not the little dodo, the original dodo, is arguably like the most famous animal that everybody talks about going extinct. Do you know why people have focused on the dodo compared to so many other animals and species that have gone extinct since humans kind of colonized the world?
Mate, I think it's just become a popular example of extinction and how extinction can be human driven, because, they said it was because people ate all the little dodo, but actually I think now they're also say it's because there's a lot of invasive species that were on Mauritius, and that was what led to the decline of the little dodo. But I suppose it was a good story and one of the first examples of extinction of something charismatic that people recorded. So yeah.
And it went extinct really quickly once humans kind of came on board, right? Like within 100 years or something to that extent.
Yeah. But then when you have something which breeds really slowly, you can drive it to extinction really fast through a combination of hunting and also invasive pests coming onto these islands, because these are naive species, and then you have these species coming on there which they've never had to deal with before, and they usually on tropical islands they breed really, really slowly, only one baby every now and then or something. And so they just are really impacted by I suppose heavy mortality from loads of different things.
Yeah, I'm actually finishing a documentary that I've been working on for the last couple years this month. Finally, I'm so excited to be done with it, but it's on the overpopulation of feral cats in Hawaii and the impact that they've had on a lot of the endemic species, because as you know, when islands tend to evolve under such extreme isolation that I think some crazy number like 95% of Hawaiian species could be found nowhere else in the world. And a lot of the species, just because the only life that ever got there either floated there, flew there, or swam there. There were no reptiles, amphibians, mammals, and most of the birds had no reason to be afraid of any mammals whatsoever. I mean, a human can go in and just pick them up. So when cats got introduced, they've kind of decimated some of those populations. But the documentary really focuses on how it's become such a highly politicized debate in Hawaii because you get animal welfare folks who want to sterilize the cats and hope that the population decline. And then you get these conservationists who are like, we need to eradicate these cats as quickly as we can. And it's a really difficult and complex situation, but I understand it well now at this point.
And it's the same issue in New Zealand. Like, and in fact, the kakapo, which I don't know if you know much about the kakapo, but it's New Zealand's big ground parrot, and it was down to like 56 birds. It's done really well this year, but they are a very slow breeding parrot, and it was also being taken out by cats. And it's only now because it's on these tiny little islands with no invasive or brought species like cats. It's got no cats, dogs, rats, like all of these things which were brought to these islands. They've all been removed, and these birds have been put back there, and they're doing quite well breeding there now without those things. But,
how did they eradicate them? Was it
this is New Zealand's specialty. It's like we are specializing in how to kill invasive species because that's our major conservation issue.
Sure. And what is the means? Is it mostly like through gunshot injection, or is it more poison dropping, or
it's pretty much everything. Like someone said to me the other day, like, you never let go of anything that you can use in your toolkit. Like if you can achieve something, you have to consider it. And sometimes we use aerial poisons, and poisons are a bit of a tricky term, and some people are quite scared of them. But
I always wondered that too, because it's like if you're dropping poison, at what point do you, like, it has to have some downstream effect outside of the invasives, except for some
poisons are very specific, or they change chemical, and the chemistry of the poison alters when it's got water touching it or sunlight touching it, and then it changes into something which is completely safe. And one of the big debates in New Zealand is about one particular poison, which amazingly is very common in tea.
Oh, really?
So, yeah, and so we drink this poison, and yet it's very effective at killing possums and rats. So we use it for that. But it is a big debate, and the same with cats. But cats,
yeah, and just to throw a little disclaimer for those listening, because I feel like sometimes, especially when it's invasive species, I tend not to kind of explain it quickly enough, just because it's so heavy on my mind because I'm working on this every day. But these are all species that have been introduced to the island, so aren't native to the island. So when the rats come in and the possums come in, a lot of these animals don't have the evolutionary defense mechanisms to deal with the predation and the natural ecosystem impact events of these species, which is why it's so important to try and find ways to remove them from the landscape.
Yeah, and a lot of the possums are actually Australian, so they're not supposed to be in New Zealand, and yet they're eating all the birds and the eggs and everything. So then that affects the trees. So
how is the kiwi bird doing in New Zealand? Because that's a similar ground walking. They don't fly, right? The kiwi bird?
No. In fact, they have wings, but they're tiny. They're about 2 centimeters, and like hidden amongst their feathers because they haven't used them in a very, very long time. and also affected by some of these species, like actually stoats or mustelids, the long...
they're kind of like weasels.
Yeah, those types of species. Yeah. They have a massive impact on the kiwis, but so do... We have had to kind of separate our pet species, like dogs, and make sure that they're not really active in our conservation areas, because if they are like getting in there, even like someone's really cute, little terrier dog, they can kill these birds because they smell good to them, and they are predators, they eat meat, dogs, so their natural inclination will be to kill, and therefore, you have to separate the two. And in the same way, there's more and more of an understanding that cats, which are not native to New Zealand, have to not also be in our conservation area because they also take out the kiwi and other species.
Is that common in New Zealand, where dogs are kind of out roaming around without leashes and collars? I know around here it's not quite as common unless you're kind of in more of the rural areas, but I know it can be different in different places.
Well, it can also be that, someone takes their dog for a walk, and even a dog without a leash, and if they take it into an area with kiwi and there is the opportunity, the dog will then, try, it's easy, KFC.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I mean, I think that's what's so amazing is when you haven't interfaced with these types of species before. Like I was looking at a lot of these videos, and the birds we're talking about in Hawaii are petrels and shearwaters and a lot of these seabirds that nest in the ground and up in the mountains. And it's not like, oh yeah, they're a little slower or something like that. They just literally don't know what to do with a mammal whatsoever. Like you can go in there, and if you find the den that they're in, just put your hands in and pick up these massive birds, and they don't know what to do. It's kind of sad to think about. Like you see some of those camera trap footage of cats getting in there and just wreaking havoc. And what really,
you just can't have both.
Yeah, exactly. And what really sunk in for me is prior to the project, I had never really, you always hear the term bird brain, and you're like, oh yeah, birds, like they can be pretty, but I got a really intimate understanding of their behavior. And the more and more you learn about birds, the more and more you're like, oh my God, like they have some incredible characteristics, and each species is so unique, and the life cycle is so powerful, and they have families in the same way that we do. I mean, for the shearwaters and the petrels, I forget which one it is in Hawaii, but basically what happens is when one of the chicks is born, they spend the first 4 to 5 years of their life burrowing into these like high mountaintops on the sea cliffs. And once they build their burrow for 4 or 5 years, it goes deep, deep into the mountain. They find a mate, they pair with that mate for life. And then they have one chick a year. And then once the chick hatches, they take turns where one will do a 7-day loop looking for food across the Hawaiian water. So basically they fly low over the waters, waiting for tuna to bring up schools of flying fish. And when the flying fish hop out of the air, the shearwater will pick it up, like eat it, and then come home at night and regurgitate it to the chick. While the other one will do this 7-day, week-long arcing journey up towards Alaska, because food can be so hard to find that they're trying to find food over a 7-day journey. And so one chick will do the daily loop 7 times. The other one does a huge loop. And then at the end of the week, they switch turns. So then the other one will start doing the 1-day loop, and the other one will start doing the 7-day loop. And I just thought it was so amazing that, one, you have this kind of family unit that can go all the way to Alaska and somehow via the stars or something understands that, okay, I'm going to go 1,000 miles back that way to the most isolated island chain in the world. And I don't know about you, but I look at birds, they all look the same to me. It knows exactly which burrow is its, which like partner is theirs, and which chick is theirs. And just the effort they go to preserve that chick. To me, that's when it really hits home, when you see these videos of cats or something to that effect that kind of get in and just ransack the birds. And I feel bad for the cats too. I mean, it's not their fault that they're out there. And that's why it is such a sensitive and understandably complex and difficult situation. So I'm not trying to demonize cats, but it is a tough spot to be in.
Yeah. Yeah, but I don't know. You only need to see so many things eaten alive to go, oh, we can't mix those two.
Yeah, no, for sure. It's just, moving on. Watch the documentary for those listening. And I'm trying not to give too much of my insight into things, because it'll be coming out in the film, and there's a lot of sensitivities there. But let's get back to the little dodo. So the little dodo is a toothed pigeon. So essentially it's like the size of a chicken almost, and has a hooked red bill. And how many do they think are still on Samoa, and can they be found anywhere else in the world?
They're not found anywhere else in the world. They're endemic to Samoa. And there used to be some other similar species in the same genus on Tonga and a few other islands at Fiji as well. But they're all extinct. This is the last of its type left. Not only the last of the species, the last of the genus. So it's the last. Wow. Yeah. And well, how many are left? That's a really tricky question, because, they're unfortunately they're declining quite fast. So things are changing quite fast. And when things are so rare, it's really hard to count them. Mm-hmm. But, if I was to make a somewhat educated kind of call, I'd say 200 or potentially less, It's like a small number now.
in the world.
Yeah, in the world.
Oh, wow.
And there is none in captivity, and in fact, there was some in captivity previously, and none of them bred in captivity. So that's not really an option currently either, because catching something which is that rare is also very difficult.
Sure. And I could imagine if they haven't been captively bred successfully, there's that added stressor that if there are so few left in the world and you're going to be taking the breeding adults out of the population, you want to make sure that that successful breeding is happening. Have you seen any chicks or anything like that in recent times?
So I haven't seen a chick ever, and I've been studying them for quite a long time. Ooh. But my field assistant had a great interaction with a chick.
Okay.
They were out doing surveys. The government staff were out doing surveys for the species, and they'd finished, and it had been terrible weather, and they hadn't seen anything. It had been 2 weeks, and so he was out in Samoa, one of the two main islands, and he was doing his laundry, because you get a lot of that when you've been doing field work. And then he looks up and he was like, "Oh, what's that? That's weird." And like he went and got his binoculars and he has another look and he's like, "Oh, it looks a bit like a chicken, but different." And then he went and got the other lady who's also working on the species, and they took some photos of it, which was great, and some video and everything. And it turned out that it was, they knew it was not a chicken because, it was actually quite hard to ID because it didn't look like the adults. It was a juvenile, and it had only fledged maybe 2 days before from the nest, or even one, because it had a weird little mohawk thing going because it hasn't even grown the feathers out over its head.
Okay.
And so they managed to get the first footage and pictures of this very rare baby bird, I guess, which was pretty amazing.
Yeah. So these folks are working on this conservation project, and they didn't even know when they saw the bird that it's that rare that people don't even totally know what they look like?
They wouldn't have recognized an adult, but because it's so rare to see a juvenile, and in fact, even when you're working on it, you see it so rarely. So
I wasn't saying that in a negative way towards them, but more just that's crazy to think that it's that rare that the people who are the most intimately involved with them are struggling to ID it even when they see it.
Yeah, but it's also partially because the baby or the juvenile looks so different from the adult.
Oh, okay.
And the beak isn't red. It's not hooked. It's straighter. It's kind of black. Instead of being having a paler grey or darker or a darkish head and then reddish feathers, they're kind of all dark and mottily. So they're a completely different color. And it just made you go, what on earth is that thing?
Yeah, and I'm going to link to photos of this for people listening in the show notes if they want to check it out a little bit more and understand it a little bit better. So what brought you to Samoa to take on this specific bird species? I know New Zealand, how far of a flight is it from New Zealand to Samoa?
Oh, it's only a few hours from New Zealand, so It's kind of close-ish.
Were you in Samoa before finding out about this bird, or was that the genesis of why you wanted to go over there?
No, so I went over to do my PhD on a different endangered species over there, the ma'o, which is a giant forest honeyeater and also endangered. And while I was working on that species, I saw my first manumea, and I realized talking to people just how quickly they were declining. Mm-hmm. And then I realized that I couldn't just write up my PhD thesis and leave because we needed more information about both birds, but also looking at, the loss in forest, and there was more needed. So I was involved with some other people with setting up a conservation NGO, because that's a critical part of conservation, is that you need organizations and bodies who will help the government.
Sure.
And we got funding to help look into what was causing the decline of the species, and also start to put in place the things that we needed, because coming from New Zealand, we know here what an impact invasive species have. and like it's drilled into everybody. You could ask a small child at school and they will tell you that's the reason why the kiwi is disappearing, because these other things from outside have come here. But that wasn't as well known in Samoa. So we decided we needed to change how people thought so that they could start addressing the issue. And this was, of course, done by I'm talking about, I worked very closely with the Samoan government, and they were. I think
that's really
amazing people there.
Yeah, I think that's really important, because oftentimes when you look at a lot of conservation issues across the board, especially when it comes kind of the exotic wildlife trade and dealing with like endangered animal parts and things, you're always like, I need this big government to really step in and take ownership of helping to mitigate this trade or this black market or this issue, or step in and help this endangered species. And I think the big missing link is a lot of times these governments have a lot to do, and the government officials are not necessarily focused on this one specific thing that obviously is very important, but it's, at the end of the day, they're taking care of their people and the economy and all of these things that play into that. So having the onus to really go in and start one of these NGOs and say, hey, listen, I know this is something that can't take up all your time, but it can take up all of my time, and let me get it on your radar, is really important.
Yeah, and I was also really lucky because I worked with some amazing people, and they were also so inspirational. So I wanted to help them so that they had the resources to do what they were really passionate about. And I happened to have some connections. So, if they needed some extra training and stuff, or they needed some extra funding in terms of collaborations, I could help put that together. And that's important part of achieving conservation. It's not only about like working on the species, it's also about helping the local people achieve conservation themselves by giving them the tools.
Well, I saw this video of, it almost looks like a big mascot of the Manu Meo bird that goes around to schools and kind of flaps around. It was like half really cute, half kind of creepy looking, but that it's really cool to show like that's the type of grassroots organization or organizational help that like really goes to inspiring kids to take care of the fact that they have an animal in their own backyard that can't be found anywhere else in the world, right?
Yeah, and I suppose the first time I had to do a school visit, I was like, oh, well, I suppose I can, a bit like that. But then I went and did it, and I did it with these guys I was working with, and it was so amazing and inspirational that I was like, oh my God, I have to do more of these. It changes the way you think. And I went back to this one area where we had done one of those school visits, and it was a year later, and they'd had this terrible flood in that area, and that entire village had been pretty much wiped out by this atrocious flood. The houses weren't standing anymore. And I was standing there looking down at this river. And then this little boy comes up to me, and he was like to me, hey, miss. And I was like, oh, did you have a house down there? And he was like, oh, yes, but I can do the call of the bird. And I was like, wow.
Oh, that's so cute.
Yeah, you can, working with the kids, you can see within a few years, they are the spokespeople. So, yeah.
Does it have a very specific call?
So the ma'o is like like that, yeah. And the manu mea is more. It has been described as somewhat cow-like.
Okay, let's hear it.
And it's somewhat of a moo, and that's more like ooh, but yeah.
I like that.
And you have to distinguish because there's a few different pigeons there, so you have to separate the manu mea out from the others, but it's much deeper and more rumbly, but sometimes you can muddle them up because you feel hopeful you've got a manu mea.
This is going to be a very dumb question, but what is so you said it's evolutionarily distinct, kind of the last of its genus, but it's also a pigeon. Where did it break away from the pigeon that everybody sees kind of in New York City or Los Angeles, or kind of
the feral pigeon, or as I like to call it, the dirty street pigeon?
Yeah.
Well, I'm not exactly sure where the dirty street pigeon lies on the evolutionary line, but they're all pigeons, but this one is kind of in the Nicobar. There's a few which are similar to the dodo. So the dodo was also a pigeon.
Oh, okay.
And so that's in that group, I suppose. But there is quite a few different, there's the doves and a whole lot of different other species.
That kind of all fall under that. Okay, that makes sense. So outside of, is invasives the primary reason that it's doing so poorly, or are there other reasons that?
Well, there is a number of reasons. Unfortunately, conservation's never easy.
Sure, yeah.
And so I suppose one is forest loss. Like anywhere, there's a lot of development occurring, and then you throw in cyclones, and that means that you have invasive trees coming in, which are taking over from the native big fruiting trees. Mm-hmm. And the big fruiting trees also are what the manumea eats. So if you have less food, it makes it harder for the birds, especially if there's a cyclone and, there's a lot of damage. And then as well as loss of habitat, there's also a problem in terms of hunting, but not deliberately for the manumea.
Like going out and hunt, like shooting the birds?
So hunting pigeons is a traditional thing in Samoa, and it used to be done by the high chiefs. That was the food that was available, and it's like fish in other places. Like you can fish, or you could go and get some meat from the forest.
Yeah,
and so it's quite understandable. But unfortunately, when they're not actually going for the manumea now when there's hunting, but people are hunting for the other pigeon species. Which is, or the lupe, which is like another big pigeon. And when they hear a similar call, like a kui moo, then they'll use shot, and shot has like lots of little pellets, and it will shoot out. And then, of course, you can get quite a lot of, it can get other things when you're shooting. And when you're very rare, the impact of hunting can be quite high.
Sure. And are the other pigeons more populated so that it's like a little more sustainable to be doing this, or is it something that they're struggling as well?
They're not doing as badly. They are not, there's not as many, there's kind of a control site, because there's also, besides Samoa, is American Samoa, where there's no guns and therefore no shooting. And so you can get an idea of what a natural abundance without hunting is like. And there are much more of this Pacific pigeon or lupe over in American Samoa than in Samoa. So hunting is having quite a big impact on that species as well. So the trouble is when people shoot the Pacific pigeon by accident, they're shooting the manumea. And because the manumea is probably not doing very well for other reasons, and one of the reasons we're pretty sure now is also cats. Did you already know that?
I mean, I saw invasives when I was reading online, so I assumed it was some mix of cats and pigs and the usual suspects, rats.
It could be pigs as well, because it's really hard to study.
Do they nest in the ground?
So that's the other really tricky thing. We haven't had many, there hasn't been a recent discovery of a nest. There's some different people who have claimed to have found a nest at different places. And so one of the things we're looking at is old journals or old knowledge that occurs, and that suggests that they nest low to the ground or even on the ground sometimes. And then some people have said that they could nest higher up as well.
Oh, that's cool. You're looking at these like 1800 like 19th century explorers and stuff who had
and the person who actually named it the little dodo, and because I went to New York to go see the very first specimen, because when people name birds, and that's what they did a lot in the 1800s.
Where is it, at Cornell?
No, it's in the New York Natural History Museum, and then they have a whole lot of other specimens in the Natural History Museum in New York. So the one's in Washington and one's in New York. So there's actually there's a lot of manumea, and I was wrong. There's a lot of manumea in America, but they've been stuffed.
So you're saying you went there and you were researching the explorer who found
yes,
it?
Peel, and so there's been two explorers, and there's their old diaries there, and like what the first guy to describe the species in the European context, he was also an artist, and they happened to have his original painting was the only painting they still have of this
Whoa.
one species, and they had his original diary in New York. So I got to read his original diary, and this man was amazing because he was a conservationist before conservation had even become a word.
Yeah.
And
That's cool.
he describes cats eating manumea in this book, or in his diary. And and his interestingly, his work got published. And there was only a few copies made, maybe like 15 or something. And then this other book with all these pictures of birds in it. And then someone else said he wasn't a scientist because he wasn't just using facts. And therefore, they rewrote a book, put their name on it, and took his name off and kept his amazing paintings, but rewrote the book with just facts like measurements and everything like that, but without this information, which is basically talking about, the impact of invasive species and all of this type of thing. Like, yeah, it was amazing reading. Like,
Yeah,
his
I
diary.
always dream of, I think I would much rather live in today's time, but there is something so beautiful about just being one of those guys who's like Charles Darwin, sitting out there and looking at pristine habitat and just sitting there with my diary and writing in pencil. And I don't know, it just seems so,
Some of it sounded good, but his diary also talked about his tropical boils and getting lost and not having a GPS. So there were some parts where I was like, wow, imagine seeing these islands in a much more pristine state and things like that. But yeah.
It's just, you can romanticize that very quickly. It's like, have you ever read Walden by Henry David Thoreau?
No. I should add it to my list.
One, I just say that because it makes me sound sophisticated, but they make you read it in high school, like where I'm from, because I'm from New England, and Walden Pond is right in Massachusetts. But listening to, when you look at Walden Pond, it's a very small, little pond in Massachusetts. It's not like the Galapagos Islands, like Charles Darwin or something like that. But how eloquently this guy wrote about just the experience he had living on Walden Pond alone it's just beautiful to see people who really observed nature in a different way back then. You know what I mean? Whereas now it's just so much easier to take in through video and all these other forms of media. Back then, you really had to be so descriptive and detailed and really observe much more intricately your environment to portray that to other people. That, I don't know, I romanticize being one of those guys sometimes. It just sounds
me
so
too.
fun.
It would have also been amazing. It's just a little bit every now and then I'm like, but you also would have no cure for that, because I picked up a few different tropical things while I was in Samoa. So
Ooh, yeah.
you only need to get dengue and these sorts of things a few times to go yeah, I'm pretty pleased with modern medicine.
I say that, and then there's times I'll go camping and it's a very glamping style thing, and after day 2 I'm like, I'm good, I'm ready to go back home. So that's really interesting. So you're still kind of figuring out where they nest, but you have a sense that it's lower to the ground. It just, I think the more and more I'm hearing about it, the more and more it speaks to how crazy difficult it is to even spot these things.
It's really difficult.
How long have you been working with them, and how often do you see them?
So maybe 8 years. And when you're in the field, it's kind of a luck thing. My field assistant, Fia, he always says, if you're looking for them, you never find them. It's only when you don't look that you find them.
That's
which
scientific.
Is very deep.
Yeah.
And that kind of gives you a feeling of what it's like working on them. But they do follow, if you figure out where one is, it will follow a certain routine for a few days. So then you can get an idea of where it's going. And we have tried to catch them, to put transmitters on them to get more information, but it is quite difficult. So, one of the things we were working on was how we could, I suppose, increase the number without having to see them all the time. Like, so one of the things we did was we've worked with different groups and encouraged certain things to be planted. And there's one amazing village in Falesela, which is one of the villages in the coast, and they're actually developing their own conservation area for manumea. Like, so they're replanting it with all the trees that the manumea need, with the hope that the manumea will be coming back there. And they've said no hunting, at least in that area.
Yeah. Do they do anything around, in Hawaii, there's a lot of predator protective fencing that they're building. So something like that place or that certain village, it'd be really cool to see if they could somehow put together some of that predator proof fencing to stop the rats and cats from getting in.
So unfortunately, because New Zealand also has quite a lot of predator proof fencing. Unfortunately, it's really expensive. Like, it's really expensive for a developing country who, you know, has a lot of different asks, but they are doing pest control, like just trapping and some poison baiting in 2 different areas with the help of Auckland Zoo. And and that is happening. It's like it's always a bit tricky, but like, because you're trying to figure out how to maximize what you're achieving for that species, and it is potentially a quite wide-ranging species. So yeah, it's not the easiest.
No, this is just like, this is why I think media around wildlife conservation is so important. Like, I look at something like this, and it certainly can, I understand, be very expensive, and particularly for a developing country. But for somebody just to tell that story through one video and document that so that people can donate to make something like this possible, I feel like so many people be like, oh, there's 200 of those left in the world at most. Like, yeah, I'll give $10 to do this and raise money on Kickstarter to get something like that going. It's just,
it would be
it's just
amazing.
like disheartening to feel like you don't want to lose an entire species of animal just because the story never got out there. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And I suppose we were doing things like that. Like, one of the things that we did as an output, because we realized I was working with one of the ladies from the village, from Falesela, and she writes children's books. So we were like, oh, let's write one on the manumea, and we can use it as a fundraising tool for then getting funding for the pest control.
Oh, that's so cool.
Yeah. And she's a teacher as well. And she also was saying, there's not that many books which are about children. Well, there is very little books about children in Samoa, you know, so they'll look at a book and it will be like a white, blonde-haired, blue-eyed child who goes ice skating, or about rabbits or hedgehogs and stuff like that. And that has nothing to do with them. So she's like, let's write one which will connect people. And I was like, oh, sounds great. So
yeah, that's so cool.
Yeah, so we did that, and it was published last year in December. Oh, not published. We did the press, you know, the stuff in November, December last year, like the release of it, and so that's one of the mechanisms that we're using to fundraise for pest control, because all the money that's generated from that book then goes towards.
Oh, that's amazing.
Yeah.
What's the story about?
Well, it's about a little boy himself looking for the manumea.
Oh, cool.
It's called Mose and the Manumea. I'll send you like the title in case anyone's interested.
Yeah, can people buy it online?
Oh yeah, it's online. It's on Amazon and stuff like that.
Oh, I'll link that for people buying in the show notes. That'd be awesome. Super cool.
Yeah, and plus the really cool thing is that the children also love it, and then afterwards they come and tell you about how important it is to save the species, and having the buy-in from people like that is part of the battle for conservation. You need to have everyone agree that something is worth saving in order for them to, you know, to actually do something.
I was talking to William Roby's show about this a couple episodes ago, who he runs or was the founder of the Sao La Working Group, which basically in Southeast Asia is working to protect the Sao La in Laos and Vietnam, which is, they call it the Asian unicorn. There's like 50 left in the world, and it's this crazy 150 to 200 pound distinct genus of bovine that was only discovered in the early 1990s. And he was saying, like, once he started working with a lot of the indigenous communities, he would explain like how important it is to protect the Sao La, and the villagers would say, oh, well, you must have a lot of these America? And he's like, no, we don't have any of these in America. And he's like, oh, well, they must have a lot in Africa. I see there's a lot of these in Africa. He's like, no, we don't have any of them. They're literally only found here in your backyard. And something like that is so empowering for people. So I think seeing something where it's a children's book of somebody who looks like you and talks about something that's so special within your own community is so powerful, especially for a child to like understand the importance of something like that.
Yeah, and like what was also really cool is I wrote all these scientific documents, as a scientist you're supposed to, about the different species and what was causing the decline, and people just weren't reading them. I mean, science is not very accessible if you're in a developing country anyway. There's all these paywalls and all sorts of stuff. But
and I'll be like, even in anywhere in the world, like sometimes scientific papers are just boring. You know what I mean? It's like
it could have been
I'll always go to
maybe
like,
it was a bit boring.
No, I'm not saying like it's boring, but it's just like for your average person who's not like you or me, who's like obsessive about conservation or something, they're much more like for instance, like when Jeremy introduced me to you, he's like, here's an article I wrote on Rebecca, and I read the article, and then it links to your paper, and then all of a sudden you see abstract and summary and these sources, and you're like, oh my God, this is overwhelming. I don't know if I'm smart enough to read this.
Yeah, and all the jargon in it. And imagine if it's not even English, isn't even your first language. Like, it's not very accessible. Anyway, we put all the science. I didn't mean you to
take that as, I'm not calling your paper boring. I'm just saying I get too stressed out reading about all these standard deviations and things, and I'm like, I'm good. I'll just read the article.
So what we did instead was we took all of the facts from all of our research over the 8 years, and we stuck it into this kid's book. And then we also gave a certain number of them away to like the Prime Minister, like the Minister of Pacific people here in New Zealand, different people cool. who had power and whose knowledge, so we could get that message out to the right people. And the really cool thing was people read the kids' book. And it had all these facts in it, so it was kind of cool because I was like, that's just all the science stripped bare with facts, but like making them interesting, and
yeah. And like ultimately, like if you're talking about an animal that there's very little recorded imagery of or video of, I don't know, when I'm reading about these beautiful species, I want to be visually stimulated by what's going on. So even if I'm an adult, like I've never said adult like that. I usually say adult. I'm trying to sound cool on the podcast. Even if you're an adult, like I'd rather look at a storybook with kids stuff going on, just so like it's just a little more engaging,
Yeah, no, and so we're really happy with that. So happy that now we've decided to do a marine version to promote marine conservation.
Oh, very cool. What kind of species is that focusing on?
That's more focusing on like marine ecosystems and like over harvesting and plastic issues and things cool. like that. But like, targeting the same kids because they like that book. So we're like, we'll give them another conservation issue.
Well, congratulations. Yeah. That's super exciting.
Yeah, thanks. Conservation can take you anywhere.
Yeah. What other conservation efforts for the Manumia are going on? So we mentioned kind of replanting, the children's book. Are there any more like direct action conservation things that are going on that somebody could help to support?
Oh yeah. So one thing that's really exciting is, so we did all the science to look at the hunting issue, and we looked at who were, I suppose, eating the species, and we discovered that pigeons are mostly eaten by the richer people, like as many occurs sometimes with different tasty things. And so now there's going to be a targeted campaign looking at pigeon consumption and like looking at giving people the knowledge of that impact in country. So that campaign has just been designed and like the document's just finalized, and I think they're going to start fundraising for that soon. But that should be that will be quite an amazing step. So I think you need to have 3 different steps to save the species. You need to address the hunting issue, you need to address the loss of habitat, and then you have to address the invasive species problem. So if you could get all of those 3, then you'll have the Manumia. But you do have to like target these different issues. Each each on their own almost, because it's like a different specialty working on how do you kill rats versus how do you stop people from hunting. One's almost like a social issue, or how do you make sure that if they are hunting, they're not going to get a marumea.
Yeah. And I think what's really interesting too is how directly applicable a lot of this work is to other species besides the marumea. And something like I'm always an advocate for people trying to like open source a lot of this knowledge, because if somebody finds something that's really beneficial to stopping rat reproduction in an invasive species, like you could completely copy and paste that into Hawaii and help to serve that same thing. So getting access to those lines of funding and that's like, it goes back to kind of spreading the word about these things where it's like, hey, I know your conservation focus is on Hawaii or something to that effect, but by giving us a little bit of money, we can try this new technology that we could implement in Hawaii or something to that effect.
Yeah, no, totally. And yeah, they should come and speak to the Kiwis. The Kiwis are really into, the people, not the birds.
Yeah.
are really into like figuring out the invasive thing, because New Zealand wants to be, we want to remove certain invasive species from the entire country by, is it 2030 or something? Like, so they're going to try and make it like, so certain islands, at the moment they're doing the Auckland Islands. So they're targeting massive islands and doing rat eradication and possum eradication.
Oh, wow. Has it been pretty successful so far?
Yeah, so it's already worked on some, and now they're just refining the details for bigger and bigger islands. So.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and then it's
That's
also about
interesting.
getting buy-in from the people, because there's also people who like cats, so it's about like getting their cats de-sexed and then getting them to agree that there'll be no more cats after their cat dies and that type of thing.
Yeah, and that's a lot of what my documentary focuses on. Is unfortunately in Hawaii, it's become such a politicized debate between animal welfare. People want to protect the cats or at least sterilize them so the population declines, and these conservationists who are like, we need to focus on eradicating them, that no matter what you do to try and help, somebody's going to have something negative to say about you. So a lot of the groups that could help, like a politician or a nonprofit or something to that extent, they just don't want to get involved, because you do anything and somebody's going to hate you for it and create a bunch of negative publicity for you. So hopefully a lot of the documentary is trying to focus on bringing people together and a little bit more of a collaborative thing to be like, we're not going to be able to make everybody 100% happy, but we have to do something before it's too late, because a lot of these species have lost 80 to 90% of their populations in the last 20 years. Not completely because of cats, but it's a large problem that's contributing.
In New Zealand, they swapped it around by saying it's nothing to do with cats, it's nothing to do with rats, it's not to do with poisons, it's about bringing back the birds. So it's about bringing back things to what they were, and that's what the topic is about. And to bring back native, and not only native, but to bring back abundance of native. Because
then you're focusing on the positive outcomes of things instead of just talking about the negative stuff that's going to be a little bit more controversial, I guess.
Yeah. And really the outcome, and really that's what we're about, is about conservation outcomes and not about the steps. Well, the steps you have to take, but Is
there any, so when you're dealing with something like the marumea, where they're so hard to find, it's very unpredictable, you don't know what the population totally is, or even like what their day-to-day behavioral characteristics are. When you start implementing these programs, are there any ways to try and measure how that's impacting the population? Maybe if you don't have the exact number, but try and get like camera trappings or recordings or anything to that effect?
So we've also been using, because they're so rare, like going out, it's not that effective. So one of the ways we have been measuring them is by putting out these automatic sound recorders. And we put, how many was it in the end? 72 or... Yeah, I think it was about 72 sound recorders out simultaneously across the entire country, which was
cool.
It was a lot of hiking. I've never been so fit in my life. And we put them all out, and then they were out there for a few weeks, and then we had to go do it all again and grab them again. So we have that database now of, like, I suppose, a baseline of the population, and then you could repeat that again and see if there was how much of it's changed and that sort of thing. But
were you encouraged after going through the database, or was it a little discouraging in terms of like how often you were hearing the calls?
No, it was good because when we were doing it, I was out there a lot, and I am quite tuned into the different bird species. So I did also see a few while we were doing that.
Oh, awesome.
Some of it was discouraging because I saw one in an area which was being logged, which was really sad.
Yeah.
But then, I also worked with and got to meet some amazing people. And because we were going all over the place, we got to meet these people in villages. And quite often they were hunters, because your hunters are your people with the great bush knowledge. Mm-hmm. And they would take us out and they'd tell us about how things have changed and, you know, why, say, the area hadn't been logged, you know, because they couldn't get the bulldozers in, and therefore how they had this amazing area. And like, so they'd tell beautiful stories about the nature and about their relationship with the forest and everything like that. So I suppose most of it was quite inspiring, but every now and then, no, they can't log it.
Yeah.
You know, yeah.
Well, it's good that more of it was inspiring than not.
Oh yeah, I think the people I got to or have worked with and I've met through doing the project they're just some of the most amazing people, and yeah, brilliant people.
What brought you to decide to dedicate so much of your life to this one species? Was there something about birds or something about conservation that spoke to you since being a kid, or why this cause? I'm always fascinated by, like, I think it's so, I say this all the time on the podcast, so people are going to get annoyed with me, but I always find it so fascinating when you look at species that are not necessarily the big megafauna or the more famous species that are really at the brink of extinction. You really many times can tie the success of them rebounding to one or two or three people who are like, I'm not going to let this happen. And you seem to be doing that for the Manu May, and I think that's amazing. But I'm always interested to be like, what drove that person to do that? Like, we talked one time on the Dr. James Burrell was on the podcast, and he talks about the Lord Howe stick insect, which was this random insect thought to be extinct that they brought back from nowhere. And I'm like, who is focusing on the stick insect? It's awesome that they're doing that, but I'm just interested to hear, like, what was the origin for what drives your passion for this animal?
I suppose it's like, how far back? I suppose I was doing my PhD. I suppose it depends how far back I go back. So I was lucky enough as a kid to grow up some of that time in Tanzania. So, you know,
cool.
Once you've spent some time in the Serengeti as a kid, you get inspired to be a conservationist.
Yeah.
But then in Samoa, I think it was kind of, in some ways, I got to be as close to one of those explorers as you could get, in terms of people hadn't been studying these species, or most of the bird species in Samoa, since they were originally shot and named in the 1800s. So since the original taxonomists, like, categorized them and stuck them into museums, there hasn't really been that much. There's been a little bit of work, but amazingly little when you look at other countries like England, Australia, New Zealand, all of these countries
Sure.
where people have been studying things for hundreds of years. So while I was there, I got to, find the first nest of a lot of different species. It's sadly not the Manumea yet, but all of the other species, I think I found 5 or 6 nests for species which had never been discovered before. So you get that feeling of like, oh my God, I'm the first person to find out this information on this species. Yeah. And the other thing that was really inspiring was, the people I've got to work with, like, because they've been absolutely amazing. And especially the people who I spent time out with in the field, like Filale and Moy and people, and Serena, and because they're also such inspiring people, because they have a lot of hope for the future. And, when you work with amazing people, it inspires you to continue working.
Yeah, so, definitely.
Yeah, that's pretty much my inspiration.
No, I think that's fantastic. I just, I think, unfortunately, oftentimes birds kind of get the shaft when it comes to conservation things. People just kind of like, yeah, they'll do okay on their own. You know, I feel like people don't care about birds as much as mammals and reptiles and things. Not that that's right.
Except in New Zealand, we just don't have that much. Like, you know, in New Zealand, the only native mammals are two tiny and of course your marine type stuff. But other than that, everything else is birds.
It cut out for 2 seconds. It's two tiny what?
Two tiny little bats, the short-tailed and the long-tailed. One bites and one doesn't.
Ooh,
so those
do people get bit by the bats?
It's only if you're holding it, and then it's trying to escape. Like they don't come down and like.
Yeah, oh my God, that's like out of a horror movie.
No, they're absolutely adorable, and yeah. So I suppose if you're from New Zealand, you're used to fighting for the birds, and because also the birds are really, when you fight for the birds, you're fighting for your forest, because your forest requires your seed dispersing pooping birds, your fruit birds, because you know, on islands you've got much more fruit. They're reliant on your pigeons to disperse them. So if you don't have these species, you lose your forests, and if you lose your forest, you lose your sponge, which will then, you know, help you with your water. You can see the cascading impact of losing these things as well. So
yeah, and you also realize how incredibly evolved certain bird species are to do one specific function within those forest ecosystems. I mean, I know in Hawaii specifically, the big thing is there was like, I forget the exact number, but tens upon tens of these honey creepers, and each one had a different beak for a different flower. So you start losing one of those species because one of those flowers has been cut down too frequently or isn't doing well for one pesticide or something. And the cascading effect can be devastating.
Yeah, no, it's amazing.
But I just want to go into some quick rapid fire questions here at the end. In your time with the Manu Mea, is there one moment that kind of sticks out as being a super special moment where you're like, I can't believe I get to do this type of work for a living?
I suppose I think that every time I see a Manu Mea, I'm like, wow, finally, because it's like finding, you know, the holy grail in the forest, the needle in the haystack. Yeah, but like, I think that's really why people really do conservation, if I'm honest, that every now and then you have those moments where you're like, wow, you know, like, and like, it's different from an office job. That's, and it makes you put up with leeches. I got a leech in my eye once. So you put up with leeches, mosquitoes, the diseases from tropical places. But yeah, every now and then, but you also get to walk out of a piece of forest and into a river which has a waterfall flowing down, and then go swimming, because you know that's what you've got there. So you can take the opportunity. So you get all those moments, and so when you balance it, those moments make it all worthwhile.
Yeah, take a couple leeches to the eye to avoid having to sit in a cubicle all day.
Exactly.
If people could help out outside of the children's book, which I'll link in the show notes, any other conservation organizations or programs that listeners can help to support the Manu Mea or just Samoan wildlife in general?
Well, they could buy one of the kids' books. That would be helpful, because then all of that money goes to pest control. I have been actually thinking of setting up something where people could buy the book for children in Samoa as well, because
that's cool.
Because that would be amazing, so that they're buying it as a gift for a child in a school where it's too expensive, you know, for them to own their own book. And also that will help with literacy, which would be cool. And Auckland Zoo also has some. So there is a few funding things. I can always type them for you if you want. Yeah.
If you want to send them my way to people listening, I'll link it in the show notes, which are in every description of every podcast. Everything we talk about, there's just a link to. So go check that out and support. How about the next 5 years? What are you focused on? The big efforts? I mean, I know we touched upon some of the big things in store for the Manu Mea, but is there anything at the front of your mind that you're super excited to tackle?
So I'm excited that they're going to be tackling the issue with hunting, because that's quite a big thing, and also quite political. So that would be really cool, and that there's restoration happening. yeah, so conservation is slow, especially in the islands. So, it's long term, just slow, slow steps.
Yep.
Yeah.
If you could put a billboard on the side of a major highway that reaches as many people as possible and disseminates one message in 10 words or less, what would you put on the billboard?
Oh, that's tricky. I'd probably put something about climate change because, frankly, that worries me the most of all the things. But maybe also
Sure.
something about how we've become too good at certain things like fishing, and how that's having a big impact on the abundance and life in our oceans as well. Because I'm also working in marine projects. So.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that goes back to the hunting thing too, is like, like we were talking about it, like if that's something that's been going on in indigenous cultures for a really long time in Samoa, I can understand the cultural importance of something like that. But then when you start tying that to guns that spray off in 10 shots versus whatever they used to be using to shoot them, it all of a sudden becomes a much bigger problem, and it's just easier to do what used to be a little bit harder, But
see, I think we're doing something much worse in our oceans, and that we're using even more sophisticated things, which are like giant nets and wrap around everything and take out everything in one go.
Oh yeah, it's not even close to the same scale. I was just trying to draw a comparison to the conversation, but I agree. Like the drift nets, the dredging of just scraping the sea floor for everything. It's not even. I mean, it's thousands upon thousands times worse. It's just like, I'm going to put this one device in and destroy everything that it touches every single day. What we're doing to the oceans is
yeah, but I don't know if you can put that
despicable.
In a sentence on a billboard.
Yeah, no, you'd sent me down a bad rabbit hole. I hate what we're doing to the oceans. It's disgusting. I also just think like what's happening in the oceans is much more greed driven than it is lack of information driven, which is what's really frustrating. Like the people who are destroying the oceans are the big companies, and it's the people who are selling in the high end markets to high end buyers. It's a lot different than some of these other more ecologically or just more. There's certain problems that are less driven by greed than things like the ocean.
I don't know. I kind of think it's tragedy of the commons just occurring in many places. The ecological tragedy of the commons thing.
Sorry, no, I don't know that.
Oh, it's a famous ecological concept that if we're given the chance, we are selfish if given the chance, unless there are community level restrictions on us. And so we'll all try and get the best for ourselves if we're given and so the examples in it, like a paddocky area where everyone's sharing it, and if they can, everyone will try and put a little bit more pressure, and so it's a little bit more stacked in their favor. And it was saying how that's human nature. But there's this lady, she got a Nobel Prize for it, Eleanor Rostrom, she's American, and she was looking at ways that society has avoided that, like that overuse of everything, and how you need to have policing in place, and you need to have all these different in a small enough society that you can monitor and all these sorts of things, and then you can actually make sure that you don't overutilize.
Oh, interesting. I'll link that in the show notes too. I haven't read that. I'll have to check it out.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. And if we can take that and distill it in 10 words or less, we'll throw it on the billboard, and then there we go.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time. I'm super impressed with all the work that you do. And like I said, everybody that takes it upon themselves to be like, I'm going to be the person to help lead the charge to save a species is somebody that I always love to get behind and support, and hats off to you for all the work that you do. So thank you from me and everybody else listening, and thank you to everybody else listening. Always appreciate it. As always, I'm going to link in the show notes to all of Rebecca's work and ways that you can support, buy the children's book. And until next time, stay wild. Thank you so much for listening. I honestly cannot express how much I appreciate you taking the time For all information regarding this episode's guest, social channels, books, how you can support, etc., please check out our show notes. If you enjoyed listening, please subscribe to the podcast. We are everywhere that you can find podcasts. Subscribe to Escape the Zoo on YouTube, follow Escape the Zoo on Instagram, like Escape the Zoo on Facebook, and please share with your friends. It honestly goes so far and means so much to me. And lastly, if you'd like to be emailed with each new podcast and any other major Escape the Zoo updates, visit escapethezoo.tv and sign up for our email list. Thank you.